continuing our series right now on making things new. And so far what we've taken a look at is the spirit of renewal, the spirit of improvement, the spirit of achievement is really a spirit of resurrection. Because for these things to happen, to make way for something better, to make way for something new, we have to carve something out to make room for that. Many times there's things that are holding us back from accomplishing those things or from drawing nearer to God in our lives. And before we can make that happen, we have to die to those things and be reborn to something better, to something stronger, to something newer. And that how we do that begins with honest reflection and taking the time to assess our lives and to take a look in our hearts and our circumstances and really find out what is happening. You know, what are the good things that are propelling us forward and towards God? What are those things that are holding us back? And then we talked about, beyond reflection, there's also confession. And that the trigger to transformation, the trigger to change, is being able to confess, to be able to admit that we have things in our lives that aren't perfect. And that when we do that, it frees us to start down a new path. It frees us from the burden of secrecy. It frees us from the tension that happens when there's sort of that unspoken awkwardness because we know that something is not quite right between us and another person or between us and a group. And then once that's aired, once that's named, now we can breathe out. But there's something that goes hand in hand with confession. And I want to, again, I mentioned we have that suggestion box out there because this was really cool. Last week I had someone come up to me after worship and say, you know what would be really good to go after this confession? I said, what? They said, forgiveness. And I said, you know what? You're absolutely right. It wasn't even on the radar. And so, you know, the input from the community is so important. So that's what we're going to focus on because truly, confession without forgiveness becomes very, very damaging. And it can become very, very hurtful. Confession with the assurance of forgiveness is healing and reconciling and restoring. And so what we are called to do as people of faith is to have a spirit of forgiveness that lives within us and that is extended freely and generously to those around us. And the reason for that, I think, is captured very, very well in these passages. In the first one, in 2 Corinthians, Paul is addressing a situation that came up between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. How many of you know that there's probably letters out there that Paul wrote that we haven't found? Well, this is one of those situations. And so what Paul's talking about basically is this. Somewhere between 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there was some kind of an interaction where somebody made some slanderous, scandalous comments about Paul or to Paul. And it ticked him off. And he says, you know, when these things were said, when the pain was caused, it wasn't just caused to me, but whatever happened, he was implying that they had offended the entire community of faith. And so somewhere between those two letters, Paul may have had a visit. At the very least, he wrote a letter. And the understanding is that in that letter, he was pretty harsh and gave some pretty serious instruction to the Corinthians about what they should do with this person that had, you know, made these comments, that had done this wrong. And some of it may even been to the point of saying, you're not welcome in this congregation anymore. Kicking them out. At the very least, it was something that was harsh enough that Paul's looking back on it and saying, what was done could be so overwhelming to this person that it could drive them away from their faith, could drive them away from Christ. And so in this letter, he's saying, now it's time to forgive. It's time to restore this man. It's time to welcome him back in so he doesn't become discouraged, so he doesn't become overwhelmed with the consequence that was given to him. Now, what we don't know is whether Paul wrote those words because he believed that the consequence that he had asked them to impose was accurate and it was time to ease off, or whether Paul maybe looked and said, you know, maybe I was a little bit harsh and a little bit rash in writing out of emotion and anger, and it was a little bit too much. But what we see here is something that I think is really critical. And it's that many times our ability to move forward is not only on us. How many of you have ever been on the receiving end of a grudge? Ever had somebody that just wasn't going to let up? Never let you forget the mistake that you made. Every time you see them, they remind you of it. Every time you're in their presence, somehow that cloud is hanging over us. And it's possible that when we don't forgive, we are actually stifling and preventing the other person from growing. Because we won't let them get out from under that weight. Or we're not able to get out from under that weight. And so as much as we may want to take some leaps and bounds and jumps forward, the rest of the world around us is saying, nope, this is you. This is your label, and it's going to stay with you for the rest of your life. Or this is your label, and it's going to stay with you for a long time until we forget about it. And it squashes us down. You ever see somebody that's quit a job because they made a mistake and nobody let them forget it, and they just couldn't handle it anymore? Or someone quits a team because they make a mistake, and every time they go to practice, somebody's giving them the hairy eyeball, or people are giving them the cold shoulder. What's the expression people usually use whenever they kind of cut ties with something and they go to another place, another group? They're making what? A fresh start, right? We use that language when we feel so overwhelmed by the fact that we can't get out from under a mistake or a label, that we got to go someplace else where that stigma is not following us. And what this is calling us to do is to be reminded that part of our job, part of our call as people of faith is to extend that spirit of forgiveness, to welcome people back in, to say, you know what, I know this happened, but just as God has extended His grace to me, I'm going to extend this grace to you, to bring that relationship back into wholeness, and so that we can be encouraged and help one another be uplifted and move forward, and so we can truly be reborn into that greater situation, that greater circumstance. And so that forgiveness is freeing to the one who is trying to move forward. But it's not the only one that it's freeing to. It's freeing to the one who made the mistake, but it's also freeing to the ones who are the victim of that mistake. How many of you have ever been that monkey with the hand in the cookie jar? Grab it all, can't get out, and you just don't want to let go of it? I've been there. We have this sense that I have a right to be angry. I have a right to hang on to this. I have a right to be judgmental. I have a right to condemn. I have a right to vengeance and all these different things. But that's not the case. Because when we hold on to those things, they begin to consume us. And then just as we are causing the person we refuse to forgive to become stuck where they are, we become stuck where we are. Because our energy is spent in that. Our energy is spent thinking about it. You ever hear the expression that holding a grudge is like allowing someone else to live rent-free inside your head? It's true. Because it's always there. It's always holding us back until we release it and realize that that bitterness is doing nothing for us or for them. And we open our hearts to grace and mercy and humility and forgiveness, realizing that we're all in this together. And you know what? Someday I may need that same grace and mercy, and if I'm not willing to give it, someone else may not be willing to give it to me. It is about this community experience. This doesn't mean that there's not consequences when mistakes are made. Don't get me wrong. This doesn't mean that whenever there is an error, whenever something happens, that everybody just says, oh, we don't have to worry about it. Consequences are part of life. But the spirit in which that consequence is made makes all the difference in the world. If the spirit of the consequence is judgment and condemnation, then it is hurtful to everybody involved. But if the spirit of that consequence is forgiveness and humble grace, then it's uplifting and restorative and healing to everybody involved. And I think Paul has a good sense of this, and it's why he's calling the Corinthian church to forgive this person, to welcome them back in, and to lift them up again. Now the thing about forgiveness is it's not just about us to us. But Matthew makes a very, very clear point, and it's in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us as we forgive others. And so this sense of forgiveness and grace is not just between us, it's also between us and God. In the sense that the way that I treat the people around me, the way that I treat the world around me, the grace that I extend to them, the forgiveness that I extend beyond myself, is the same forgiveness that I am going to be asking from God. And so that if I extend a hand of bitterness and judgment and condemnation to the world, then that's what I'm saying to God to do to me. But if I extend a hand of friendship and grace and mercy and forgiveness to the world, that is likewise what I'm asking God to do for me. It's an extension, I think, of treat others as we would wish to be treated. Do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. And that's kind of what we're saying to God when we do that. There's a sense that when we claim that grace from God, that it does something in our hearts, that it transforms us into something new. And just as it gives the other person permission that they can move forward, it gives us permission that we can move forward, and it frees us from the guilt that shackles us many times to the past. And that's the final piece I want to address this morning, is that there's often someone that's left out when we talk about forgiveness. We talk about forgiving each other, and the necessity and freedom that comes from that. We talk about forgiving one another because that is directly connecting us to God, and that directly affects our relationship with God, because it's extending God's grace or reserving it. But many times we don't talk about forgiving the one person that tends to help us or hem us up more than anybody else. Anybody know who that is? It's ourselves. Anybody in here your own worst critic? Okay? We have to learn to forgive ourselves when we make mistakes. Many times our ability to accept God's forgiveness and accept the forgiveness of others, it hinges on whether or not we can forgive ourselves. Because many times, at least for me, if I can't forgive myself about something, I have a hard time believing that God or anybody else is going to forgive me either. And it jams up our relationships. Many times when we can't forgive ourselves, we become completely stuck where we're at. It's that place where we have trouble looking somebody else in the eye, not because they have something against us, but because we have something against us and we haven't been able to overcome it yet. Maybe we shy away from going to certain places because we're weighed down with the guilt that we won't let ourselves let go of. And so we hang on to it. And it causes us not to be able to be renewed. It causes us to not be able to move forward. It's hard to carve out that thing that we're hanging on to because we're hanging on to it. And we're focused so intently on it. But I believe that what God is calling us to is forgiving one another, of embracing the forgiveness that comes from God, and letting ourselves forgive ourselves when we make a mistake. Because when we do that, we then experience a freedom, we experience a joy, we experience a peace, we experience a strength, we experience a direction that we couldn't have otherwise. We experience growth and transformation. Because not only have we recognized where we made a mistake, but we have thanked God and the world around us for the grace that allows us to move on from that. And now we have this experience behind us that says, now I know what not to do, which helps me do what I know I should do. And we chart a new course, a better course. Our relationships become deeper because they are forged in these fires of forgiveness and conflict and tension that happens. And when we come through on the other side and we're still friends and we're still family and we still love each other, that bond is stronger. We can help each other much more effectively when we have this sense of forgiveness because we have the experience in the past, so that when I'm going forward and saying, all right, I'm free to go this way. I have other people around me and I have the experience in the back of my head that shows me where the little warning markers are to not go back on that path. Have you ever heard this expression? When we ask for forgiveness, God takes our sin and throws it into a lake of forgetfulness. But sometimes we forget, or we ignore the no fishing sign, and we go and bring them back. And we dredge it all up again. This sense of forgiveness and grace amongst us is part of that accountability and part of what helps us to become more who God has called us to be. Now, I'm not saying that forgiveness is easy. It's real simple for me to stand up here and say, you should forgive each other and forgive yourself. Have a nice day. But every single one of us that has been slighted, every single one of us that has had a guilty conscience, we know that that forgiveness is not necessarily an easy thing to accomplish. It's a struggle. It's a battle within our hearts, and it's a battle within our souls, but it is a battle that is worth fighting. And it is a battle that is worth winning, and it is worth taking the time to do it, because on the other side of that battle, on the other side of forgiveness, is new strength, is new peace, is new grace, new power, new purpose, and new direction. And I think that's what we're called to every day when we wake up in the morning. Amen?
Amen.